La 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 la.
Hello, I'm Jonny Stryder. I'm here with Jim Davidson, managing partner of Eldar Capital. That's eldarcapital.com. Eldar with an A, as in Lord of the Rings. Hi, Jim. Thanks for joining me today. How are you this evening?
Thanks, Johnny. I'm doing great.
Have you seen the news about what's going on in the UK with arresting people for statements made about riots and whatnot on Facebook and other social media?
Well, I have. I've seen quite a bit of that, and it's hard to miss these days. It seems like the UK government has taken the position not only can they arrest people who post things that they don't like and throw them in jail. There's already been several convictions. Apparently, the wheels of justice move very fast when they want them to. And several people have been put in jail for like 3 years for things that they've posted on Facebook or Twitter. But they've also now taken the position that the UK government can arrest Americans. And there has been no meaningful response from the American government. The American government has not said, well, we are withdrawing our ambassador from the Court of St. James because this has been said, and we don't agree with it. We don't agree that the UK government can arrest and extradite Americans for free speech. And they've also not made any public statements. The president or the vice president could get on television and say, this is wrong. We oppose any kind of restriction on American freedom of expression by the British government. They are not our government. They don't have the right to, they don't have the authority to arrest anyone in America or extradite them for things they have said. And so that is a particularly egregious violation of the terms of governance, which is that the government is supposed to protect the people, especially from foreign powers. And, I think it goes beyond saying that based on the Magna Carta and the rights of 1688, the British people are experiencing having their government make war on them. The government of England is making war on the English people, and the English people therefore should say, well, they have abdicated government. If you make war on your own people, then you're abdicating government. And where else have I seen that? Somewhere, America.
Declaration of Independence, I believe. Well, I guess before we sort of go down that road too far,
well, but I'm also saying that the American government has been making war on the American people. But yes, you're right. It isn't the Declaration of Independence. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. I get my news from Twitter these days, so I saw some of the postings about this. I didn't go down the rabbit hole. I'm curious though exactly what was said, and what I've seen about this law. It seems terribly vague, like it would be a prior restraint on speech were it judged correctly in the U.S. Just anything. Let's see, is it that gives offense is not. It can't be can't be said. So I'd be curious to get get the language of the actual rule that's being cited against these people, and I'd also like to look and see what did they actually say. Was it really something threatening? Were they advocating violence against people of a certain race or something, or was it something much more much milder?
One of the stories that I read suggested that someone had been arrested and convicted for improperly identifying the murderer of the stabbing victims and the little children at the Taylor Swift yoga dance party, whatever it's called, who apparently they are now claiming is Christian, but was misidentified as Muslim, and simply saying that he seems to be from an Islamic group is regarded as sufficiently provocative in England for you to be locked away for 90 days or some other length of time. And that to me is bizarre. Making an error or making a false statement like that doesn't seem to me to rise to the level where you need the government to intervene. But I think it's actually much worse than that. The government is taking the position that if you have opinions, you have to be silenced. And only people who are speaking the right thoughts are allowed to have opinions and express them. And this is, there's a famous English novelist named George Orwell who wrote a book, 1984, in which he described that as wrongthink. If you are arrested for wrongthink, they will torture you until you only see four lights or whatever it is.
Yes, until you wait for your execution with gratitude, I think is how that book ended.
Yeah, it's rather grim, but then George was emulating old Arthur Koestler, who wrote Darkness at Noon, and that so enthralled our friend George Orwell that he decided to write novels for a while.
Yeah, the whole story, it makes so little sense to me. I really am curious about the facts because, well, there's a history, right? There's the Great Britain, or was it the UK or whatever it was at the time, originated the Magna Carta, right? Which was one of the early Enlightenment, I suppose, political Enlightenment documents, which gave at least rights to the noblemen
well, there are a number of these documents from kings and signed by the king and various barons. And 1215 is the first of these. I gather there was a meeting at Runnymede, and the king agreed to the terms rather than go to war with the barons, who had him outnumbered and outclassed with the English longbowmen. The yeomen came on the side of the barons and the idea of parliament. And then there was, a long period of time when things got worse and worse under various kings. And in 1649, this came to a head at the banqueting house when they chopped the head off of Charles I. And there is a guy in Buckingham Palace who calls himself Charles III. I call him Upchuck III. One of my friends calls him Chuck the Turd, which I think is also quite droll. But in 1649, they were done. Oliver Cromwell was leader and were going from victory to victory. And then Cromwell died, and there was very poor succession. Anyone who supports Trump, they also hate conservatives, they hate Christians, and they speak very openly about this, about how, we're weird, creepy, and controlling, which I regard as euphemisms for white, conservative, and Christian. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong about what they're saying.
Okay, well, a quick search. I may have been wrong about hate speech. If you express hatred in connection with an actual crime,
that makes it a hate crime.
Yeah, that makes it a hate crime, but there's actually not a law against hate speech.
Cool.
Well, and then here's another article that talks about regulating hate speech. This is from 2018. Fighting words exception. We know about the fighting words exceptions. Intimidating acts exceptions. This is the First Amendment. California hate crime laws. Hate crimes. The Ralph Act established the right to be free of violence or threat of violence based on characteristics such as race, color, sex, or political affiliation. It can be enforced by any private attorney with a penalty up to $25,000 and actual damages or even punitive damages. To prove a violation of the Ralph Act, the plaintiff must show that the defendant was motivated by a certain perception of the victim, such as race, committed or threatened a violent act, and that the victim suffered physical or emotional harm. So at least there has to be a victim, even if it's just an emotional victim.
Yeah, I don't know what emotional harm is, but I'm sure I've suffered it.
Yes, I don't know how that's
done. For $25,000, I'm willing to say that I might have suffered emotional harm from something that was done.
Yeah, it's not my area of practice. I'm sure there are things that need to be proved for emotional harm, and and visits to the doctor and psychologists. And
You mean you might have to talk to a shrink? That's
another
not
form.
a showstopper for me.
So, but even in California, this shows, I think, which is one of the most autocratic states in the United States, at least in certain respects, and others maybe not so much. California was a refuge for people who wanted to pursue different lifestyles, like, gay and lesbian, when that just wasn't permitted in other states.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even in California, it doesn't sound as bad as the UK, but in the UK, there's a number of different laws that outlaw hate speech, and I'm reading from this article on the Week's article. I'm not sure what the date is, but it came up on the Google search. Section 4 of the Public Order Act of 1986 makes it an offense for a person to use threatening, abusive, or insulting words or behavior that causes or is likely to cause another person harassment, alarm, or distress. This law has been revised over the years to include language that is deemed to incite racial and religious hatred, as well as hatred on the grounds of sexual orientation, and language that encourages terrorism. And that's also outlawed by the Terrorism Act of 2006, which criminalizes encouragement of terrorism, which includes making statements that glorify terrorist acts. Now we're getting Section 127 of the Communications Act of 2003 makes it illegal to send a message via a public electronic communications network that is considered grossly offensive or of an indecent, obscene, or menacing character. This offense is incredibly broad and has been used to address jovial, albeit misjudged communications. It carries huge implications for freedom of expression, says the Justice and Freedom Campaign group Liberty. Well, that sounds like that's the sort of thing that we're dealing with. I don't know which law the recent folks were charged with, but the one for misidentifying a criminal as belonging to a specific religion doesn't seem like that in itself would be an act of hate. It's simply a mistake. And
it sounds like a mistake to me, but I don't know. Yeah. I think the whole idea of having a government with authority over people's speech in any respect is mistaken. I think we have too much government. We have too many governments. I went to Somalia, so the people who are getting ready to throw in the comments, if you don't like it, move to Somalia. Well, I did. And they have way too many governments. They have traditional and legislative governments. It's terrible. So I don't think we need nearly as much government. What's that?
Have you ever visited Somalia, if I may ask?
Yes. Yes, I worked with Michael Van Natten between 1995 and 2002 when he passed away. And I was in Somalia for quite a bit of 2000 and 2001.
And so
we were working on a free port. We were going to build a free port. We were going to build a new Hong Kong on the Gulf of Aden, but it didn't work out.
Oh, the free cities. Yes, those never seem to work out, these free cities. There's always a political opposition to them.
Well, there are some free trade zones that have worked. Titus Gabel is doing one in Honduras, I believe. But free trade zone is a much more narrowly defined thing than a free city project. But yeah, I actually know quite a lot about the history of these things because I've been looking for ways to build them and finding out that you can't just dredge up the sand north of New Zealand in international waters and create your own island. They did that in 1970. A guy named Mike Oliver, who was a real estate guy from Las Vegas, convinced Sir John Templeton of the Franklin Templeton Group of Funds to put $1 million in his hands. And back then, 1970, the price of gold, world price was around $39 an ounce. So it's $24.30 now, something like that. You can look it up. But So it's, arguably, 800 times as much money. 800 million would be a way of estimating that. And he used this money to dredge up the sand from the sea bottom and build up these little seamounts that were about 20, 30 feet below sea level, and created what he called the Republic of Minerva, and stocked it with a radio and a beacon and emergency supplies. And the New Zealand government recognized the Republic of Minerva because these particular places were regarded as hazards to navigation. And having a beacon letting people know where they were on the ocean surface was helpful. This was 1970s, before global positioning. So, well, everyone knows where they are now.
Yeah.
But, back then nobody knew. And so they were running ships aground, and New Zealand was actually affected by this because their trade was mostly through those waters to get to Japan and South Korea and so forth. So the CIA hired the King of Tonga to send 6 canoes full of war criminals, 400 nautical miles across the ocean. I think is awesome. They paddled their way across, and they conquered it. And the UN recognizes territory acquired by conquest. They wrecked everything. They destroyed the beacon. And since then, the sea has swallowed up the Republic of Minerva. And that is what you get for listening to Sir John Templeton, who said you can't have guns on the island. You can't. As it happens, they invaded while no one was there. No one was on the island at all. They were all getting ready to make arrangements for relocating there, but they were back in the States, Mike and his crew. So
you said they were hired, these Tongan mercenaries.
Well, you should look at the embassy. The U.S. embassy in Tonga became much bigger after that, and their airstrip became much longer and more well paid. So yeah, I would say they were paid off. That's my opinion.
Okay.
The King of Tonga might take a different view of this. I don't.
So they were acting at the behest of the King of Tonga. But I missed what you said at the start of that story. Who had hired them, or who had set that in motion? Or is that
the CIA, the United States Central Intelligence Agency, was behind the destruction of the Republic of Minerva, because having new countries show up was not okay with them. I mean, can you imagine if everybody who could move some sand around could build his own island? How many new countries would there be every year? Thousands.
What about these floating free cities? What's going on with the floating free cities?
Well, in 2004, I was invited to an event called Freedom Fest. You may have heard of.
Yes.
My friend Mark Skousen puts it on every year. For a long time, it was in Las Vegas, and then he was told during COVID that you can't do that anymore. So he moved it to Memphis. And that didn't work. So he moved it back to Las Vegas. In 2004, he started it with an event in the Paris Hotel in Las Vegas. And he had a panel discussion. And I was speaking about Somalia, and Patrice Friedman was speaking about seasteading. And Patrice was very convincing on this topic. He thinks that people should set up artificial platforms and start their own countries in the ocean. Patrice is kind of an interesting descendant of Milton Friedman. He's the grandson of Milton Friedman. And his father is David Friedman, who is the author of The Machinery of Freedom and several other books about free market anarchy, would be how I would describe it. The problem is that platforms in the ocean are vulnerable. There used to be a thing off the coast of England, about 6 miles off the coast of England, called Ruff's Tower. During World War II, it was an anti-aircraft tower, and it had guns, and it had men living in these chambers within the tower, and they would go up to man the anti-aircraft guns if there was an alert. And sometimes I'm sure they shot down the occasional German bomber. After the war, it was abandoned, and around 1968-69, there was a thing in Europe called pirate radio, where people would sail around on big ships and broadcast radio because they weren't allowed, for whatever reason, to broadcast rock and roll music on the nationalist socialist radio networks. So they started their own unlicensed broadcast transmitters. And they were chased from time to time by national militaries. But if they were hanging out loitering in international waters, there was very little that could be done under the laws at the time. And there was a gentleman in England who was running a pirate radio station off of a ship, and he happened to know about Ruff's Tower, and he thought, well, that would be a great place. So he went and took it. He actually occupied it with men and radio transmitters and power generators, and it had a helicopter pad that he made out of the upper surface. The guns had been taken away long since. And so for a long time, he called this Sealand, and he called himself, I think, Prince Roy of Sealand. And you can read this story online if you want, various places. Mm-hmm. But in 2002, a friend of mine shipped a server over there, and it was operated from Sealand. They had internet connections. I had a little satellite transmitter. And right around 2010, I think it was, it could be a little later, the Special Boat Service of the of the British military, the Special Boat Service burned it to the waterline. And it was unoccupied at the time, but all of the servers were destroyed, and Sealand is no more. And that was guys with demolition charges. If you can imagine one of these remote Sealand seasteading places gets hit by a torpedo and the submarine disappears, what are they going to do? What can you say? Well, our seastead was blown up, and we think it was a torpedo, but what can we prove? And what are your rights in international law? Well, it turns out there's a thing of the 1982 Law of the Sea Treaty, which says that you are not allowed to make artificial platforms in international waters without the authority of some nation state, some existing nation state. And if you do, they can be occupied by any nation state's warships. So that kind of, puts paid to the whole idea. And then the question is, will they enforce that clause? And I don't know. I mean, I think it's all case by case. If you're a wealthy billionaire and they want to leave you alone on your, artificial platform, I think there was a James Bond flick where there was some offshore platform that would submerge into the ocean, and rather than having a underground layer, he had an underwater layer. The Bond villain, I don't know, Spy Who Loves Me.
It goes back to the Nautilus, and who was the antagonist in the Nautilus story? But
Captain Nemo.
Captain Nemo, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I love that book as a.
Yes, he shows up again in the sequel, The Mysterious Island. And Nemo is a Greek word, I believe, meaning no one. And it shows up in the Odyssey. Odysseus is confronted by the guy with the one eye, the Cyclops. And the Cyclops asks, "Who are you?" And rather than giving his own name, he says, "I am no one. I am Nemo." And so he's called no one the whole time. And then when the other, I don't know, Cyclopses or other people's, the allies of this creature ask, "Who did this to you?" He says, "No one." And they're like, "Oh, well, okay, no one did it. You did it yourself. Okay, yes. Whatever." So it's a strange part of the Homeric epic poems.
I've met somebody named Nobody. Just a bit of trivia. So in real life, when I was working as a tax preparer briefly, and a guy came in.
That's absurd.
Well, a long story there. I think I'd rather not.
But it paid the bills. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's this. Some tax preparers are actually heroes of freedom. I'll just put it that way. But this young man had immigrated from Vietnam, and when he was offered a Social Security card, he legally changed his first name to Nobody. His last name was Nguyen, Nguyen, which is kind of like Smith or Jones in the U.S. There's a lot of, right? So his name was Nobody Nguyen. I think I'm allowed to say that publicly. I don't remember his Social Security number, but it was actually on his card.
I would be shocked if you were able to rattle it off.
But I think Nemo had the right approach for people seeking to, and Nemo, yeah, he had some anger, Captain Nemo, and he unleashed it maybe inappropriately at times, if I remember.
Well, he was anti-war, so he would attack
Yeah.
warships, but
Yeah.
he left the commercial ships alone.
Yeah. So, but his whole thing of secrecy and not making a target of himself for no purpose, I think there's a lesson there for seafarers and whatnot. You can get a boat and travel around the world and have a lot of freedom if you know how to feed yourself and have the right skills. But as soon as you say that you're a seastead, then you attract attention.
I think that's true. There's a thing called cruising in the Caribbean, which is different from how it is in San Francisco. Cruising means that you get on your sailing vessel or your motor vessel and you just travel around and you make port wherever you make port, and you can write books and do whatever internet kind of businesses you have from the ocean. And a lot of people do it. I would say, 8 or 10,000 such vessels are in the Caribbean all the time. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are people like that in the Mediterranean and other large bodies of water that are relatively calm. You don't want to do that too much in the polar seas because of the Coriolis effect.
The harsh winters, right?
Yeah, the wind speed increases dramatically the further you go towards the pole.
Yeah, you get some tremendous storms up there. But you could. The Caribbean's a good place. I suppose the Mediterranean is another one of those places. I don't know how cruising works there, but you have the Greek islands.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of those.
Yeah.
There are a lot of places like that. Indonesia has a lot of islands, like 9,000 islands, which startling.
And you're kind of out of the hurricane track down there. I think right along the equator.
Yeah, if you get that far south, yeah.
Yeah.
There are a lot of hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico, but between 8 and 9 degrees north and 9 degrees south latitude are the doldrums.
Yeah.
And you don't get as much wind speed out of them, and the other winds steer things away from the equator.
Yeah, everything goes north. Everything goes north.
Yeah, things don't cross the equator. There's very few weather patterns that actually go across the equator. We used to talk about that when we were, we called ourselves survivalists back then. In the 1970s, we would talk about, what if there were a lot of nukes going off? Where would you go? Well, you would want to go to the southern hemisphere because they are meteorologically isolated from the north, and there wouldn't be as much fallout because very few storms cross the equator ever.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole thing on living free of oppression, it seems like most people have no conception. I don't know what the percentage is, but at least in the so-called developed countries, the number of people cruising or doing a rough equivalent on land, or even sitting around wishing and hoping for it and planning to actually do something like that, as in percentage terms, I have the feeling it's quite small. There may be hundreds of thousands.
Well, there are about
of
2 million people who do what they call van lifing, RVs and vans that they live in, and they travel from place to place. In the West, there's a lot of Bureau of Land Management land, and you can camp on BLM land for 14 days and not move. But if you try to stay for more than 2 weeks, they will come eventually, not right away. They monitor some places that are close to the freeways because they get a lot of traffic. But if the BLM comes and says, we think you've been here for more than 14 days, you have to move on, then you relocate. But you only have to relocate a few miles. You don't have to relocate to another country. And so people they call it the van life, and van lifers are maybe 2 million Americans who don't have a permanent address, or they have a post office box somewhere, or a mail-a-box, UPS store, address, and they get official mail there. A lot of these vehicles are licensed out of South Dakota, which doesn't even require you to be present to get license tax from South Dakota. They have a very low property tax, so you don't pay much, and the renewal is very inexpensive and easy to get, and people just get their South Dakota. They call them SD tags, which is not to say that you have to have license tag. I know people who have. There's a place called freedomfromgovernment.com. I think that's the name of the site. But they sell a license tag that it's got letters and numbers on it, but it says at the top, DOT exempt, Department of Transportation exempt. And I have seen people with those tags, cop car comes up behind them, looks at the tag, doesn't stop them. So it's a valid approach to denying that they have any authority over you.
So it's a South Dakota DOT?
No, the particular freedomfromgovernment.com site, it just says DOT exempt. It doesn't say it's from South Dakota or any other state. It just says that this is not a license tag. The thing about being
ordinary,
not having
the DOT only has jurisdiction over certain types of commercial vehicles, right?
Of course.
Yeah. So this is a residential vehicle. It's not being used in interstate commerce.
What it's saying is, yes, that our right of travel is invoked by saying we're DOT exempt, and we're not traveling in traffic. Traffic is actually defined as commercial transport. Having passengers or cargo for hire means that you're in traffic.
Yeah.
It doesn't refer to how many cars there are in front of you on the road. It actually is a legal term. And the technique is to wear one of these tags on your car rather than having to renew every year. And that's particularly interesting for people in places like California, where it's really expensive to get a license plate and to keep it renewed. Because California, Proposition 13, the American people in California rose up against the tax authorities and limited their ability to change property taxes. And the communists in the state legislature in Sacramento were like, wow, we can tax everything else. And they do. Mm-hmm. You live in California, you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, and I pay my cars are a little bit older, but it's still over $100, between $100 and $200 to renew the license every year.
Plus, they have this plan, I think, by 2036 or something, everything has to be electric. So then you won't be able to renew your.
Well, the new sales, I don't know that I think there are limits to even what they can push the people to do. And just judging, well, I'm in Los Angeles. I live near a large cemetery. It's very hard to get parking near the central of any of the urban sections of LA, like where I live. But around the cemetery, there's parking because it's just not convenient. And there are RVs, old beat-up RVs, that are just parked there for months. It doesn't seem that they're enforcing against. I'm sure that there's some city ordinance against doing that, but they don't seem to enforce it. And
it's different in different places.
Yeah, and this is, I think, characteristic to California. There's a lot of laws on the books, but not all of them are enforced. The sheriffs and the police they're selective about what laws they enforce.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's a town of Berkeley on the San Francisco Bay, and I was up there a year ago. It would have been the springtime of 2023. And you can park on the pier, the Berkeley Pier. It's like a 2-week rule. You have to move your vehicle after 2 weeks, but people move from one end of the pier to the other, and so they don't have to move very far. And there were dozens of van lifers there at that time. There are places like Quartzsite has a festival every year in the late winter, and Quartzsite in Arizona, and it's on the border between California and Arizona, or near there. And there are a lot of people who show up and camp on BLM land, and they have Schoolapalooza is the name of the festival. Mm-hmm. There's a festival up in New Hampshire called PorcFest, Porcupine Freedom Festival. There's now 2 in the Midwest, in Oklahoma, in October and in April, midfest.info. So there's a lot of organization around not having a home and not being tied down to an address. Because if they want to arrest you, they have to come to your home. And what are they going to do? Your home is not where they left it. People don't renew their driver's licenses. So far, the cars are willing to start without a license, stuck in the. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Fifth Element, but the taxi driver in that movie has to put his license in the vehicle.
Have you seen Idiocracy? It's kind of the same story there.
Yes, I don't like it much, but I've actually read the book that it's based on, Cyril Kornbluth, The Marching Morons. Is this? It's actually a novella.
It's not, nonetheless quite prophetic, I would say, Idiocracy.
Yeah. Well, yeah. What are you going to do? Yeah. If you let crazy, stupid people run things, they become crazier and stupider as things go on.
Yes, and it's definitely progression. I think with everyone glued to their screens, and not really to learn anything that's life-enhancing or moves them on the path towards transcendence or self-improvement, but just to simply pass the time, whether it's playing stupid little games or flipping through TikTok videos.
Or watching podcasts from erudite gentlemen talking about freedom in the UK.
No. We're in a separate category.
Yes, we're the kind of...
and there's no hate crime. There's no hate crime going on here. We're all about peace towards all people. All honorable people deserve respect. Yes.
So you know this symbol in England, right?
I do not.
Oh, this is their peace symbol in England. It's different from this, which is the American version.
Oh, really?
And this comes from Agincourt. The French king, or whoever it was at Agincourt, sent heralds to the English lines to intimidate the archers. He said that we would cut off your first 2 fingers if you lose this battle. So, you won't be able to pull the longbow anymore. You won't be able to shoot,
Yeah.
Because you need these 2 fingers to do that.
Yeah, you pull back and the shaft of the arrow goes in between those 2 fingers. Yeah.
And it startled everyone that the English won that. They had like 4,000 total troops, and there were like 35,000 knights on the French side. Some people say there were even more, like camp followers, 60,000 additional people. So they were vastly outnumbered, but the French idiotically were facing into the sun, uphill in a rainstorm, and the archers were all in cover.
They were
so it's hard to get behind them.
Rain and sun at the same time?
Well, the sun was behind the English, mm-hmm. and there had been a rainstorm the night before, so it was muddy.
It was muddy, slippery.
And I think it was raining in the morning too. But anyway, they were drowning in the mud. The knights in their armor would be knocked off their horses, and they would be drowning in the mud of Agincourt. And anyway, so after the battle, the English knights took prisoner the more important, the ones that would have ransom, took a bunch of the French knights and began marching them away. And the longbowmen did this to show that they still had their fingers. And this is a gesture they make in England, meaning, up yours, buddy.
Up yours, yeah. So it's a gesture of defiance.
And we've shortened it by one finger, but we still do that. But that's not a hate crime, right? That's just that's just historical. We're just talking about Agincourt, really.
Yeah, we're not directing this at any living or even dead people. It's such a tragedy that all this death and killing goes on in the name of royalty.
Yeah, I'm opposed to royalty. Well, I believe that there is one king, Jesus, and that Samuel was very clear in the Old Testament that it was a bad idea to have kings, and we should give that up. We should stop doing that.
Yes, I'm with you on that, but well, that's a whole nother discussion on the Messiah and what the Abrahamic faith teach about that, and the differences there. But some of the Jews are still waiting for their Messiah King to return.
Yeah, they call him Maschiach.
Mm-hmm.
And they say that they're waiting for him, yes. They say that they're waiting for someone to fulfill all the prophecies. And I feel that they're kind of missing the thread. I feel that the prophecies were fulfilled, but, here we are.
Yes.
They also have a tradition in the conservative Hebrew faith of the return of Elijah. They do the Passover meal, and there's always an empty place set for Elijah in case he shows up, because they're very well taken with the whole the stories of Elijah and the Old Testament, where he is carried off into heaven in a fiery chariot.
Yeah, a bit of a tangent, but of course, that's part of the gospel story too. That John the Baptist being Elijah, the one,
or Elisha. There's two of them,
Well, making straight the way of the Lord.
Yeah.
Right. And but that didn't take among the certain religious Jews. It did among some.
Well, the Pharisees didn't like any of that, and they were very angry with John the Baptist. So eventually they arranged for his arrest, and then Herod, while he had John in prison, talked to him a bunch and thought that he should, learn from this guy. But then one of the questions he brought to John the Baptist was, should I be allowed to marry my brother's wife?
Mm-hmm.
And John was like, no, that's crazy. Your brother's still alive. You can't do that. That's sinful. And the wife had her beautiful daughter dancing for the king at one point, and the king said, I'll give you anything you want. And so Salamis goes and asks her mom, what should I ask for? Ask for the head of John the Baptist. So John's head is chopped off. The interesting question is Elizabeth, his mom, the house of Elisha or the house of Elijah? And the Greeks, the Hellenization of names in that time just screws everything up. So I couldn't tell you.
I missed that last bit about Elizabeth being
right. So if you read about John the Baptist, his mom is the wife of a temple priest.
Elizabeth. Oh, that's a house of Elijah or Elisha.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, I'd never heard that before. That's interesting.
Yes. I had a lady friend in college, and her name was Elizabeth. So I looked up this stuff to figure out, could I impress her by talking about her name?
That's the etymology. It comes from Elijah or Elisha. But pretty close for those who don't know the story. Elisha was Elijah's acolyte or follower,
disciple.
Yeah.
Followed them around.
Carried on the tradition.
Got the mantle.
Yes.
Yes. He was there when the
he actually
period
got the
arrived,
mantle, right? Yeah. The actual mantle. Right.
The actual mantle of Elijah was.
Yes. And Elisha was
and then some children wanted to make fun of him.
The bear story is Elisha, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, bears do occasionally come out of the woods and tear youngsters to death.
Well, especially if they're mocking someone for having a bald head.
Yeah. Well, as you know, I'm sort of interested in crypto, and I guess one of the things that it allows is the sort of living off the grid, where you can do transactions um, without using currency. Of course, you could have done that, and you can still do that using uh, metals, silver and gold. But the nice thing about crypto is that unless someone knows you have it, it can't be seized from you. As long as you can remember your keys, um, it's purely a mental asset in that sense. And so, how many of these people so now it's possible to legally avoid taxes, and whether you're using um, just simply by staying under the line where taxes need to be paid. And the IRS will do this thing where you have no visible means of support. So if you've got a nice car and nice houses or a nice house and you're not reporting any income, they will actually impute income onto you. They have laws on the books that allow them to do this. They look at the cost of living, and I ran into this when I was doing tax preparation.
They say this is how they got Dillinger and Al Capone.
Yeah, so no visible means of support. But if you're living in an old van and you can sort of prove your receipts and your costs, there's no proof that you're making more than uh, a poverty level of income. I actually paid when I was homeless. Well, I was following as a disciple of Jesus, didn't have a place other than a tent to sleep, and I had no regular income. Occasionally worked for a little cash here and there. I didn't file taxes for 6 years, and when I decided to come back under the thumb of Sauron, um, I was asked about my failure to pay taxes. So I had to fill out a form and basically declare that I had no income, and that was the last I heard of that.
And that's generally speaking something that you can expect from any tax authority anywhere in the world, is that it's basically a farming operation. And if there's no harvest, they don't make very much effort to toil in the field. So if you have an income over $400,000, you can be sure they're going to be looking very carefully at your tax returns. But if your income is $35 or $40 or $80,000, there's really not that much they expect to be able to grab.
Yeah.
So unless you're making political statements that they don't like, they're not going to probably audit you if you're a small fry. And they don't really spend much time looking either. If someone goes off the books and disappears and leaves no forwarding address, they will send letters. The IRS did not receive your 1040 for the 2024 tax year, sir. But if the letters are returned, return to sender, addressee unknown, if they get no response, they don't do much follow-up unless there's someone they're trying to get. Obviously, John McAfee discovered that they will go to great lengths to get certain people. Mm-hmm. And he was a very publicly tax rebellious person out in the world, sailing from place to place, and they eventually had him arrested in Spain, and he eventually died or was killed in jail.
Yeah.
So it pays to be under the radar, but it also pays to understand the enemy, which is that they're not wanting to work very hard, or they wouldn't work for the government.
That's right. Well, how do you feel? Do you feel like it's sinful or wrong to try and make money, fiat currency, to do businesses? What's your feeling about that? Knowing that as soon as you have a bank account and you're handling large money flows, you're going to be dealing with taxes and laws and all the rest.
Well, there's a lot to that. One of the things that you can do with the existing legal situation is you can start a not-for-profit organization, which you can have it receive funds from you, which are tax deductible as charitable contributions for you if you have taxes. And there are reporting requirements. If it's a 501c3, you have to report once a year to the IRS how much has been brought in and what's been spent on. Mm-hmm. And
if it's less than $50,000, it's a postcard.
I think it's actually $500,000. So you could check me on that. But we had $450,000 of income for the Houston Space Society in 1995. And I went ahead and filed the form, and they wrote back, and they were very stern. Unless you have more than $500,000 in income, do not ever file again. We don't want to hear from you. But that was 1995. It may have changed since then. The state also allows you to form a nonprofit without bothering to go to the IRS and getting a 501c3, which is a lengthy and can be a tedious process. So once you have an incorporation, you can go to your bank and say, I would like to open an account for this outfit. And you already know me, so you don't need more ID from me. And can you get on the IRS website and create a taxpayer identification number for this nonprofit organization? Mm-hmm. And they do that routinely and start a new bank account. And then you have a bank account that is not in your name, but for which you sign. You can do that with corporations too. You can create as many corporations as you want. And in some places, it's very inexpensive. An LLC costs you $50 in Wyoming or something. Yeah. So you can have many bank accounts which do not imply that you have income. And corporations lose money all the time. In fact, there's a whole tradition of the tax loss carry forward. I think there is a restaurant chain here in Oregon where the tax loss carry forwards are enough to cause people to acquire this. Every year or 2 years, they have a new owner for this chain of restaurants. And nobody takes it very seriously. They don't spend much time, investing in it because it's tax loss. What is it that you're doing using fiat currency and using using bank accounts and potentially earning profits? Well, and I think that's very much a case by case thing. Is whether it's moral or immoral, it depends upon what business you're doing and whether other people are harmed by your business. I would say the pharmaceutical industry is entirely harmful. Generally speaking, it's nothing but poisons that they're selling, and they harm a lot of people. Thalidomide is one of the great cases for the pharmaceutical industry being harmful, and then they created the FDA, which pretty much just signed off on all of the Vioxx and mRNA vaccine and things.
Yes,
so,
yeah.
So I think that I think it is possible to be in business and be ethical, but I think that it's also important to remember that we are called upon to care for one another. Love yourself, love God, love your neighbor. Those are the three axioms that are all of the laws and the prophets are come down to those three things. And caring for your neighbor means that you have to think about whether children are being, provided for, and do they have education? Are the elderly being provided for in their, later life? And are the sick and the dying being cared for in some way that, and if you're not dealing with those topics, then, maybe you should be tithing at a church that does. But people have a moral obligation to create a community. And we used to have a word for that. We used to call it Christendom. That the people who were faithful to the teachings of Jesus were creating the kingdom of heaven, which is Christendom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've kind of lost that. There doesn't seem to be much consciousness of that out there, but it's certainly a concept I admire and hope to support.
So how are we doing on time, brother?
Well, we're at 54 minutes. We can call it for the day. I think there's
Well, I have a question. Did we talk about the Reputon glass as much as you wanted to last time?
The Reputon glass, which is a way of displaying reputation information. I think where we'd left it was the the really the difficult part with reputation certifications are who's doing the certifying. Is there collusion
Yeah.
involved? How can you trust the rating? Um,
Who shall guard us from the guardians themselves?
yeah, and I think that's I don't have an answer for that. I've thought about this problem a lot. And
Well, it becomes recursive, right? So if the reputation is besmirched by a negative review from someone who also has a negative reputation, then doesn't that cancel it out? But yeah, it's a really interesting question: is how can you establish continuity in the Reputon glass?
yeah, that's right. And then all identity is an issue. Um, and I don't think there's I mean, outside of Christendom or an equivalent type of community where people know each other personally and they know all the nuances, and there's a discussion going on among people about the character and personalities of people in the community. So I think that's the only way reputation really works. I think distilling it into a number, I mean, it's useful. It's used in credit reports, but how can we actually enhance uh, Christendom, to use that term, or let's call it a community of free people? Can we enhance a community of free people with a reputation system? I'm kind of on the fence. One time I thought, oh, this would be great, but now after sort of uh, considering and trying some things and butting my head against various walls, I'm not so sure that even a decentralized reputation system that's completely in your own personal wallet and under your own control uh, has some. It becomes a threat vector, possibly. But I think it's an interesting topic, and if
Do you remember Newt Gingrich and Nancy Pelosi right around 2010 during the Obamacare discussions saying that because everything was becoming digital, that individual Americans would have their digital records and could simply go from one doctor's office to another, and it would all be instantly available. They wouldn't have to fill out more forms and go through a lengthy check-in process.
Mhm.
And that never happened, but that is one of those things that was promised by this transition to Obamacare, was that we would be able to have a digital set of records. And I think that's also hazardous. I think that, I mean, unless that system uses something like Filecoin, where the data is incontrovertibly in a blockchain and deep within it, because they could add something to your medical records saying that you're, mentally unstable. And what are you going to do? It's there in your records. It's your official. It's your permanent file.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I'd ask is, um, could we go into this topic deeper on another discussion? I'll come prepared with more examples and questions, and
I'm all for that.
as someone who thinks deeply about these things, I'm sure you'd have some interesting insights. So I look forward to doing that. We'll talk about reputation systems. We'll talk about free communities and how can we enhance them with digital tools, or are we better off staying away from digital tools as much as possible? It's a trade-off, I suppose. Either way. So let's. Oh no, cat. Oh no. Oh no.
The cat timer.
Yes, yes, he's been prowling around. He wants me to feed him, so the cat timer has sounded, and good seeing you, Jim, and see you again soon.
Yeah, it's good. Good talking to you, sir.
Okay, have a great evening.
Yep.
Bye.